This is Chapter 4, Section 3, titled France and Britain Clash, beginning on page 104. American Diary. In 1754, a small force of colonial soldiers led by a young George Washington fought the French in what is today western Pennsylvania. Washington later stated that the French kept up a constant fire upon us, which was returned until the most tremendous rain filled our trenches with water and wet the ammunition in a small temporary post called Fort Necessity, and left us nothing but a few bayonets for defense. Quoted in an eyewitness history, the colonial era. British-French rivalry, main idea. Rivalry between Great Britain and France led to a war for control of North America. History in you. Is it sometimes difficult to stay out of a conflict when people around you are arguing? Read to learn how Native Americans became involved in the conflict between the British and French. As a young military officer, George Washington fought with British forces against the French. Both forces wanted control of lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. During the 1700s, Britain and France were two of the strongest powers in Europe. They competed for wealth and empire in different parts of the world. This rivalry caused bitter feelings between British and French colonists in North America. This bitterness increased when British interest turned to the Ohio River Valley. The French regarded this territory as their own. They did not want British colonists sharing in their profitable fur trade. In the 1740s, hostility between the two forces grew. British fur traders built a fort at a place called Pickawillany. Acting quickly, the French attacked Pickawillany and drove the British traders out of Ohio. French troops also began raiding towns in Maine and New York. In response, some New Englanders captured the important French fortress at Louisburg at Cape Breton Island, north of Nova Scotia. Much to the disgust of the New Englanders, Britain returned Louisburg to France. Native Americans take sides. The French and British both knew that assistance from Native Americans could help them win control of North America. The French had an advantage over the British because they had many Native American allies. Unlike the British, the French were interested mainly in fur trading. They did not want to take over Native American land. Also, French trappers and fur traders often married Native American women and followed their customs. French missionaries converted or changed the religious beliefs of many Native Americans to Catholicism. For these reasons, Native Americans often helped the French and raided British settlements. The Iroquois Confederacy. The most powerful group of Native Americans in the East was the Iroquois Confederacy, based in the New York area. The Confederacy initially included 5 nations: the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Oneida. Other groups of Native Americans later joined or were conquered by the Iroquois. After the Tuscarora joined in 1722, the English referred to the Confederacy as 6 nations. The Iroquois managed to remain independent by trading with both the British and the French. By skillfully playing the British and French against each other, the Iroquois dominated the Great Lakes area. By the mid-1700s, however, the Iroquois came under greater pressure as the British moved into the Ohio Valley. Eventually, the leaders of the Confederacy gave certain trading rights to the British and reluctantly became their allies. By taking this step, the Iroquois upset the balance of power between the French and British that had been so difficult to establish. Reading check. Explaining. Why did hostilities between the French and British increase during the early 1740s? American colonists take action. Main idea. The American colonists prepared to defend themselves against the French and their Native American allies. History in you. Has anyone ever tried to take something that was yours? How did you react? Read to learn about how the colonists responded to the growing conflict between France and Great Britain. A group of Virginians had plans for settling the Ohio Valley. In the fall of 1753, Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia sent a surveyor named George Washington into the Ohio country. Washington was 21 years old. His mission was to tell the French that they were trespassing on land that Great Britain claimed. He was to demand that they leave. Washington delivered the message, but it did no good. The French told me, Washington said later, that it was their absolute design or plan to take possession of the Ohio and by God they would do it. Washington's first command. In the spring of 1754, Dinwiddie made Washington a lieutenant colonel. He then sent Washington back to the Ohio country with a militia, a group of civilians trained to fight in emergencies of 150 men. The militia had instructions to build a fort where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River, the site of present-day Pittsburgh. Washington and his troops arrived to find the French already building Fort Duquesne on that spot. Washington established a small post nearby called Fort Necessity. Although greatly outnumbered, the troops of the inexperienced Washington attacked a French force. The French quickly forced Washington's soldiers to surrender. The British soldiers were later released and they returned to Virginia. Washington's published account of the ordeal made him famous throughout the colonies and Europe. Washington had been defeated at Fort Necessity. The colonists, however, regarded him as a hero who struck the first blow against the French. The Albany Plan of Union. Meanwhile, representatives from several colonies met in Albany, New York in June 1754 to discuss the threat of war. They wanted to find a way to defend themselves against the French. They also hoped to persuade the Iroquois to support the British. The representatives adopted Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union for a united colonial government. Franklin's plan called for one general government for 11 of the American colonies. Not a single colonial assembly, however, approved the plan. No colony was willing to give up any of its power. Disappointed, Franklin wrote, "Everybody cries a union is necessary, but when they come to the manner and form of the union, they are perfectly distracted." The Albany meeting failed to unite the colonists in fighting the French. Soon, a full-scale war, the French and Indian War, erupted. Reading check. Describe Washington's expeditions into French territory. Section 3, Review. Define the following: convert, Iroquois, confederacy, design, militia. Main ideas. Number 3, explaining. How did the Iroquois remain independent from both the British and the French? How did that change? 3, identifying. What happened as a result of Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity? Critical thinking. Number 4, analyzing. Why did Benjamin Franklin propose the Albany Plan of Union? Number 5, actually no, we're going to skip that one and go all the way to 7. Answer the essential question. Why did conflict arise in North America between France and Great Britain? That concludes Chapter 4, Section 3.